In the eastern Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, there existed a civilization so refined and prosperous that later Greeks would weave its memory into legend. Between 3200 and 1600 before the Common Era, the Minoans built something extraordinary. Palatial centers adorned with frescoes of dolphins and flowers, networks of trade that stretched across 3 continents, and a society where women held positions of remarkable prominence. Archaeological evidence from Knossos, Phaistos, and Millennia reveals a people who had mastered architecture, engineering, and artistic expression centuries before classical Greece emerged. They created a writing system we still cannot fully decipher. They built roads and aqueducts. They cultivated olives and grapes, sailing their vessels to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Their palaces stood without defensive walls, suggesting a confidence born of prosperity and security. For over 1,000 years, Minoan civilization flourished, reaching its zenith around 1700 before the Common Era, when their cultural influence dominated the entire Aegean world. Then, sometime around 1600 before the Common Era, everything changed. On a day that would echo through history, the volcanic island of Thera, located just 60 miles north, underwent a cataclysmic eruption, one of the most violent explosions in recorded prehistory. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Ash blanketed the land. Tsunamis submerged the coasts. In a single catastrophic moment, Europe's first great civilization faced its reckoning with nature's overwhelming power. Before the great palaces rose from Crete's fertile soil, before the traders carried Minoan goods across the wine-dark sea, before the frescoes of leaping dolphins and elegant courtiers adorned stone walls, there was simply the island itself. And on this island, in the shadow of Mount Ida's snow-capped peaks, human beings began to build something unprecedented in the ancient world. The story of Minoan civilization does not begin with a single dramatic moment or a legendary founding. Instead, it emerges gradually from the archaeological record, layer upon layer, like the gradual brightening of dawn. The earliest evidence of human habitation on Crete dates to approximately 9,000 years before the Common Era, during what scholars call the Neolithic period. These first settlers were not the sophisticated palace builders who would later define Minoan culture, but rather hardy agriculturalists and herders who recognized in this Mediterranean island the promise of sustenance and survival. What drew these ancient people to Crete was geography itself. The island occupies a strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean, roughly midway between Europe and the Near East, between Africa and Asia Minor. Its volcanic soil proved exceptionally fertile, capable of supporting wheat, barley, and the olive and grapevines that would become the foundation of Mediterranean agriculture. The surrounding seas teemed with fish and provided natural highways for trade. The island's mountainous terrain, while challenging, offered natural harbors and defensible positions. In every practical sense, Crete was ideally situated for a civilization to flourish. For millennia, however, the Cretan inhabitants remained relatively isolated, developing their own distinctive culture in quiet separation from the great civilizations emerging elsewhere. While the pyramids were being constructed along the Nile and the ziggurats rose above Mesopotamian cities, Crete developed at its own pace, following its own path. This independence would prove crucial to the unique character of Minoan civilization. The transformation from simple Neolithic settlement to something more complex and organized began around 3,000 years before the Common Era, during what archaeologists designate as the Early Bronze Age. Copper and tin had been discovered and combined to create bronze, a metal far superior to stone for tools and weapons. This technological advancement marked a threshold in human development, and on Crete, it coincided with growing population, increasing trade, and the emergence of more sophisticated social structures. The archaeological evidence for this period comes primarily from excavated settlements and the artifacts they contain. At sites like Vasiliki in eastern Crete and Myrtos in the south, archaeologists have uncovered pottery, tools, and dwelling remains that reveal the daily life of these early Bronze Age Cretans. The pottery, in particular, tells a story. Early Minoan ceramics were often decorated with mottled patterns created by holding the vessel in a flame, a technique that produced unpredictable but striking effects. Later, geometric designs and representations of natural forms, especially spirals and marine creatures, became increasingly common. These vessels were not merely functional containers for storage and cooking. They were expressions of artistic sensibility and cultural identity. The settlements themselves were modest by later standards. Homes were typically single or two-story structures built from stone foundations with mud brick walls, roofed with branches and clay. They clustered together for mutual protection and community support, though there is little evidence of the kind of defensive fortifications that dominated mainland Greece. This absence of elaborate defensive architecture suggests a society not primarily organized around warfare and conquest, a striking difference from contemporary civilizations in the Near East and mainland Greece. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, Minoan civilization entered what scholars call the Middle Bronze Age, and here the archaeological record becomes far more dramatic and revealing. The population expanded significantly, settlements grew in size and complexity, and most importantly, the first palatial structures began to emerge. These were not merely the residences of kings or powerful individuals, though they certainly served that purpose. They were multifunctional centers of political power, religious practice, economic organization, and artistic production. The earliest of these palaces appeared around 1900 before the Common Era, and they would define Minoan civilization for the next 3 centuries. The palace at Knossos on the northern coast of Crete became the largest and most elaborate of these structures, though substantial palaces also developed at Phaistos in the south, Mallia on the central coast, and Zakros in the east. These were not isolated royal residences, but rather the hearts of thriving communities, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, workshops, storage facilities, and sacred spaces. The design of these palaces reveals much about Minoan values and social organization. Unlike the rigid symmetry and fortress-like appearance of contemporary Near Eastern palaces, Minoan palaces developed organically, with additions and modifications made over generations. They were built around open central courtyards, which served as gathering places and ceremonial spaces. Multiple stories rose around these courtyards, creating complex internal spaces that served different functions. Grand staircases connected levels, while a network of corridors and passages linked different sections. Storage rooms, known as magazines, contained enormous clay jars called pithoi, some standing as tall as a human being, used for storing grain, oil, wine, and other commodities. These storage facilities suggest that the palaces functioned as economic centers, collecting and redistributing resources throughout the community. What particularly distinguishes Minoan palaces from their contemporaries is their apparent lack of emphasis on military defense. There were no thick defensive walls surrounding these structures, no battlements or watchtowers. Instead, the palaces were remarkably open to their surrounding communities. This architectural choice suggests a society confident in its security, organized not around warfare, but around other forms of power and prestige. Whether this confidence was justified or perhaps tragically misplaced would eventually become one of the central questions of Minoan history. The artistic achievements of the Minoans during this period reveal a civilization of remarkable sophistication and aesthetic refinement. Minoan pottery, which had been developing for centuries, reached new heights of technical skill and artistic expression. Potters created vessels of extraordinary delicacy, often featuring naturalistic designs of plants, animals, and marine life. The famous marine-style pottery, which flourished in the later stages of Minoan civilization, depicted octopuses, fish, and seaweed with such vivacity that the creatures seemed to move across the ceramic surface. These were not simply decorated utilitarian objects, but genuine artworks, suggesting a society where artistic expression held considerable value. Beyond pottery, the Minoans developed a sophisticated tradition of fresco painting, creating large-scale murals on the interior walls of palaces and important buildings. The technique required skill and speed, as the pigments were applied to wet plaster and had to be completed before the plaster dried. The surviving frescoes, preserved through the very catastrophe that would end the civilization, provide extraordinary windows into Minoan life and values. They depict scenes of religious ritual, athletic competition, courtly ceremony, and natural imagery. The famous bull-leaping fresco, discovered at Knossos, shows acrobatic performers grappling with a charging bull, an activity that appears to have held deep religious and cultural significance. These artistic traditions, whether in pottery or fresco, reveal a people who found meaning and beauty in the natural world. Marine creatures, flowering plants, birds, and animals appear constantly in Minoan art, rendered with careful observation and genuine affection. This is fundamentally different from the geometric abstraction and symbolic formalism that characterized much contemporary art in Egypt and the Near East. The Minoans looked at the world around them and tried to capture its living essence. The society that produced such art was clearly organized in a complex hierarchy, though the exact nature of political authority remains mysterious. The palaces must have required enormous resources to construct and maintain, and their decoration with frescoes and valuable artifacts demonstrates the concentration of wealth and power necessary to commission such work. Yet unlike Near Eastern monarchies, there is little evidence of colossal royal statuary or grandiose proclamations of divine kingship. The few human figures that appear in Minoan art tend to be relatively small in scale and are often depicted in contexts of religious ritual or courtly ceremony, rather than in poses of domination or conquest. Scholars have proposed various theories about Minoan political organization. Some suggest a theocratic society in which religious authority was paramount, with priestesses or priests wielding considerable power. The prominence of female figures in religious contexts, apparent in both artistic representations and in the layout of sacred spaces, has led some researchers to propose that Minoan society may have granted women unusual authority and respect compared to contemporary civilizations. This remains debated, but the evidence certainly suggests that women held important social roles, whether as priestesses, in courtly contexts, or in economic life. The economic foundation of Minoan prosperity was built on agriculture and trade. The fertile volcanic soil of Crete produced surplus grain, wine, and olive oil that could be exported to less fortunate regions. The Minoans became traders and sailors, establishing commercial networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean and into the Near East. Archaeological evidence of Minoan pottery, tools, and other goods has been found in Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and throughout the Aegean Islands. In return, The Minoans imported cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory, and other luxury goods that demonstrated their wealth and international connections. This trade required ships, and the Minoans became skilled seafarers. Though no actual Minoan ships survive from this period, artistic representations and the logistical requirements of their trade networks indicate they constructed vessels capable of substantial cargo and extended voyages. These ships became the vessels through which Minoan culture spread throughout the Mediterranean, influencing the artistic styles and cultural practices of neighboring peoples. By approximately 1700 before the Common Era, Minoan civilization had reached what scholars call the height of the Middle Bronze Age, a period of remarkable prosperity and cultural achievement. The palace at Knossos covered more than 200,000 square meters and employed hundreds of workers in its operation and maintenance. The smaller palaces at Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros were themselves impressive structures, centers of regional power and influence. Beyond the palaces, Minoan communities flourished. Prosperous towns and villages dotted the island, connected by a network of paved roads that facilitated trade and communication. This was the world at the moment before catastrophe, though of course the people living in this world had no way of knowing what lay ahead. They built their beautiful palaces, created their magnificent art, sailed their ships across the Mediterranean, and lived their lives within the rhythms of agriculture and trade. They developed a writing system, known to modern scholars as Linear A, to record their economic transactions and perhaps to preserve religious texts or administrative records. This writing system remains only partially deciphered, keeping their written words largely inaccessible to us across the span of nearly 4,000 years. The Minoans worshipped gods and goddesses in sacred spaces, conducting rituals that we can only partially understand from artistic evidence. They celebrated religious festivals, engaged in athletic competitions, and gathered in palatial courtyards for ceremonies of profound significance. They were a people of the sea, yet also rooted in the fertile earth. They were traders and merchants, yet also artists and creators. They built no empires of conquest, yet their cultural influence extended far beyond their island home. This was the Minoan civilization at its moment of flourishing, before the fires came, before the waves rose to swallow their cities, before the great silence fell. To understand what was to come, one must first understand what they had achieved, the heights to which they had climbed, the beauty and sophistication they had created. For the tragedy of the Minoans is not simply the story of a civilization's ending, but the story of what was lost, what could have continued, what might have been. The origins of Minoan civilization, therefore, are not merely the beginning of a story that would end in catastrophe. They are the foundation of something remarkable, a testament to human creativity and resilience, to the capacity of communities to organize themselves around principles of beauty and trade rather than warfare and domination. The Minoans inherited an island, developed its resources, and created a civilization that would become legendary in the memory of later peoples, a civilization whose artistic achievements would continue to inspire and astonish thousands of years after its destruction. This is where the story begins. Not with the end, but with the beginning, with the slow emergence of a remarkable people from the depths of prehistoric time into the light of history. And it is in this understanding of their origins, their achievements, and their values that we can begin to comprehend both what they built and what they lost. The early Bronze Age palaces that emerged across Crete during the 19th century before the Common Era represented something unprecedented in European civilization. These were not merely fortified strongholds or granaries, but rather centers of administrative complexity, artistic patronage, and what we might recognize as the first true urban planning on the continent. The transformation from the scattered farming communities of the early Bronze Age into a palace-centered society happened gradually, across generations, as prosperity accumulated and ambition crystallized into stone. The first of these palatial structures rose at Knossos, situated in the north-central region of Crete, near the coast. Around 1900, before the Common Era, the inhabitants of this region began constructing a building of unprecedented scale and sophistication. Unlike the defensive fortifications that characterized contemporary civilizations in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, the Palace of Knossos was designed with openness in mind. Its courtyards faced inward, creating spaces for gathering and ceremony. Its corridors branched in seemingly labyrinthine patterns, yet each passage served a specific function. Storage magazines lined the western wings, their large ceramic vessels called pithoi, capable of holding grain, oil, and wine. These storage facilities represented the palace's role as the economic heart of Minoan society, collecting the agricultural surplus that sustained the island's growing population and financed its artistic endeavors. The architectural choices made at Knossos reveal much about Minoan values and social organization. The absence of defensive walls around the palace suggests a society confident in its security, perhaps protected by naval power rather than terrestrial fortifications. The presence of multiple staircases, some descending into the earth itself, indicates a complex vertical organization of space. Scholars have identified shrines and ritual spaces scattered throughout the palace, suggesting that religious authority and administrative authority were deeply intertwined. The royal quarters, decorated with frescoes and equipped with advanced systems for water management and drainage, demonstrate that comfort and beauty were not luxuries reserved for gods, but were integrated into the daily lives of the elite. Contemporaneous with, or shortly following the construction at Knossos, similar palatial complexes arose at Phaistos, in south-central Crete, and at Malea, along the northern coast. Each palace showed regional variations while maintaining certain shared characteristics. The Phaistos Palace occupied a hillside location, its terraced construction adapting to the topography in ways that created dramatic visual effects. The Malea Palace featured the most regular geometric layout of the three major complexes, its central court flanked by symmetrical structures. These palaces were not isolated monuments, but centers of larger settlement patterns, with residential areas, workshops, and shrines clustering around them. The construction and decoration of these palaces required unprecedented mobilization of resources and labor. Limestone blocks weighing several tons had to be quarried, transported, and fitted together with remarkable precision. The interior walls demanded frescoes of such sophistication that artists must have trained for years to achieve the fluid, naturalistic style that characterized Minoan painting. The subjects of these frescoes provide windows into Minoan life and values. At Knossos, the famous bull leaping fresco depicts young athletes, both male and female, grasping the horns of a charging bull, their bodies arched in acrobatic defiance of gravity. The artist captured motion, musculature, and psychological intensity with a realism that would not be matched in Mediterranean art for another 1,000 years. Other frescoes show processions of women bearing vessels, gardens overflowing with flowers and plants, and marine scenes populated by dolphins and octopi, rendered with careful observation of nature. The development of Minoan material culture during the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 1900 to 1600 before the Common Era, demonstrates an explosion of artistic achievement and technical sophistication. Ceramic vessels produced in Minoan workshops became objects of genuine beauty, Their forms evolved from practical containers into works of art. The Kamares ware, named after a cave sanctuary where examples were found, features thin-walled vessels decorated with elaborate painted designs in white and orange on a dark background. The patterns incorporate spirals, geometric forms, and naturalistic images of plants and marine creatures. These vessels were not produced for local consumption alone. Archaeological evidence shows that Kamares ware was exported throughout the eastern Mediterranean, reaching Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and the Aegean Islands. This widespread distribution of Minoan pottery indicates not only the excellence of Minoan craftspeople, but also the extent of Minoan commercial networks. The Minoans developed a sophisticated system of maritime trade that connected them to the ancient world's major centers of power and wealth. Archaeological evidence reveals that Minoan merchants operated trading posts on the islands of the Aegean, at coastal settlements in Anatolia, and along the Levantine coast. In Egypt, Minoan goods appear in contexts dating to the reign of Pharaoh Ahmose of the 18th dynasty, roughly 1600 before the Common Era, indicating established diplomatic and commercial relationships. Egyptian records refer to a land called Keftiu, which scholars identify with Crete, and depict Keftian envoys bringing gifts and tribute to the pharaoh. The reverse flow of goods is equally evident. Egyptian scarabs and other luxury items appear in Minoan archaeological contexts. Lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, was worked into beads and ornaments in Minoan workshops. Obsidian from the volcanic islands of the Aegean was traded and utilized for tools and decorative purposes. This extensive trade network facilitated not merely the exchange of goods, but also the circulation of ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations. Minoan artists adopted and adapted Egyptian motifs. Minoan architects may have been influenced by Egyptian examples when designing the massive stone construction of their palaces. At the same time, Minoan pottery styles and artistic conventions spread to the Aegean Islands and influenced the developing civilizations of mainland Greece. The Minoans were not simply recipients of cultural influence, but active participants in a dynamic Mediterranean cultural sphere, both taking ideas and offering their own distinctive contributions. The development of writing represents another crucial achievement of Minoan civilization. Two distinct writing systems emerged on Crete during the Bronze Age. The earlier system, known as Cretan hieroglyphic, appeared around 1900 before the Common Era. This script utilized pictorial symbols, many derived from recognizable objects like tools, weapons, animals, and plants. Cretan hieroglyphic inscriptions appear on seals, vessels, and other portable objects. The script appears to have been used primarily by the elite for administrative purposes, perhaps recording transactions, inventories, or religious dedications. The exact meaning of most Cretan hieroglyphic inscriptions remains unknown, as the language they represent has not been definitively identified, though some scholars believe it may represent an early Indo-European language or a non-Indo-European Mediterranean language. Around 1700 before the Common Era, a new writing system, Linear A, emerged and gradually replaced Cretan hieroglyphic. Linear A consists of approximately 90 symbols, each representing either a single sound or a syllable. This syllabic writing system was far more efficient than hieroglyphic for recording language and appears to have been used for administrative documents, religious dedications, and possibly literary texts. Thousands of Linear A inscriptions have been discovered on clay tablets, pottery vessels, and other surfaces throughout Minoan sites. Despite extensive scholarly effort, Linear A remains undeciphered. The language it records does not appear to be Greek. and no bilingual texts have been found that would allow for decipherment through comparison with a known language. This linguistic mystery adds to the sense of cultural distinctiveness that the Minoans possessed. They spoke a language, wrote it in a script of their own invention, and that voice remains silent to modern ears. The religious beliefs of the Minoans are similarly known to us through fragmentary evidence that permits interpretation, but not absolute certainty. No temple structures comparable to those of Egypt or Mesopotamia have been identified. Instead, sacred spaces appear to have been distributed throughout the landscape and incorporated into palace complexes. The hilltop sanctuaries, such as those at Mount Euctus and Mount Ida, served as focal points for religious practice. Here, on elevated ground, the Minoans made offerings to their deities. Pottery vessels, figurines, and other objects have been recovered from these sanctuary sites, representing centuries of accumulated religious devotion. The female form dominates Minoan religious iconography. Figurines depicting goddesses with raised arms, wearing elaborate clothing and jewelry, appear frequently in archaeological contexts. These may represent a mother goddess or fertility deity. Some scholars have suggested that Minoan religion centered on a female divine principle, with priestesses playing prominent roles in religious ritual. The bull also held sacred significance, appearing frequently in artistic representations and apparently serving as a sacrificial animal in religious ceremonies. The role of women in Minoan society appears to have been remarkably elevated compared to contemporary civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and mainland Greece. Women appear prominently in fresco paintings, depicted wearing fine clothing, jewelry, and elaborate hairstyles. In scenes of ritual or ceremony, women occupy positions of prominence. The bull leaping fresco includes female athletes alongside male participants, suggesting that women participated in activities that required strength, training, and access to resources. Administrative documents in Linear A, while not fully understood, appear to record transactions involving both men and women. Female religious specialists, apparently priestesses, are depicted in various artistic contexts. This visibility of women in Minoan art and society stands in stark contrast to the historical record of ancient Mesopotamia, where women's roles were far more circumscribed, and to the later Greek world, where women were largely excluded from public life. The economic organization of Minoan society revolved around the palace complexes and their role in managing agricultural production and craft manufacture. The storage facilities within the palaces received agricultural surplus, which was then redistributed according to the palace's needs and decisions. This redistribution system sustained specialized craftspeople, religious practitioners, administrators, and the military forces that protected Minoan interests. The palace workshops produced luxury goods for the elite market and for export. Potters, metalworkers, stone cutters, painters, and other skilled craftspeople worked under palace patronage, creating the distinctive artistic products that made Minoan goods desirable throughout the Mediterranean. The evidence suggests a hierarchical society, with the palace elite occupying the apex, supported by an administrative and military apparatus, with a substantial middle tier of merchants, craftspeople, and priests, and a broader base of farmers and laborers. By approximately 1600 before the Common Era, Minoan civilization had achieved a level of sophistication, prosperity, and cultural achievement that was unmatched anywhere in Europe. The palaces stood as monuments to generations of accumulated wealth and artistic ambition. The trade networks extended across the Mediterranean, bringing goods, ideas, and prestige to Crete. The artistic traditions had developed distinctive styles that were admired and imitated far beyond the island's shores. The religious practices and beliefs had crystallized into coherent traditions that were expressed through architecture, art, and ritual. The writing systems recorded the language and preserved administrative records. The population had grown substantially, supported by agricultural innovation and intensive cultivation of the island's resources. This was the peak of Minoan achievement, the moment when the civilization reached its fullest development, when its power and influence were at their height. The palaces were populated by a sophisticated elite. The workshops hummed with productive activity. The harbors saw merchant vessels arriving with exotic goods. The festivals and ceremonies drew crowds to the palatial courtyards. The frescoes were fresh and bright, the paint still vivid. The population enjoyed prosperity and security. Yet beneath this stability, forces beyond human control were gathering. The island of Crete, so blessed with natural resources and favorable location, sat in a geologically active region. To the north, separated from Crete by roughly 70 miles of open water, lay the island of Thera, also called Santorini. Thera was volcanic. Its hills formed from the accumulated deposits of countless eruptions across millennia. The volcano slumbered during the Minoan period, but it did not sleep permanently. Beneath the island's surface, pressure accumulated in magma chambers. Tectonic forces shifted and strained. The geological clock was counting down toward a catastrophic release of energy. The Minoans of 1600 before the Common Era could not have known what was coming. They had no instruments to measure seismic activity, no theoretical framework for understanding plate tectonics, no way to predict the future. They lived in their moment, building their palaces, creating their art, conducting their trade, performing their rituals. They could not see the shadow that was lengthening across their world, could not hear the distant rumblings that presaged the transformation of their civilization. The rise of Minoan civilization was complete. The development had reached its apex. The great palaces stood in their full glory. The artistic traditions had achieved their most refined expression. The trade networks extended to the horizons of the known world. The religious practices were established and elaborate. The writing systems preserved the language and recorded the transactions of daily life. The population flourished in security and prosperity. This was the moment of Minoan splendor, the high point before the descent, the peak before the fall. In the generations that would follow, the civilization would face challenges that would test its resilience and ultimately transform its world. But in this moment, at the threshold between the Old Palace period and the New Palace period, between the early development and the later elaboration, Minoan civilization stood at the zenith of its achievement, a beacon of culture and prosperity in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The story of the rise had been written in stone and paint, in pottery and precious metals, in the records of distant lands, and the memories preserved in legend. The Minoans had created something remarkable, something that would echo through the centuries long after their palaces fell silent. They had built a civilization that valued beauty and commerce, that honored the divine feminine and engaged in international trade, that developed writing and artistic expression of extraordinary sophistication. They had, for several centuries, created a world of peace and prosperity on their island, a world that would later inspire wonder in those who came after, a world that would become legend. The Minoan civilization reached its zenith in the 16th century before the Common Era. By this time, the great palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros had become centers of extraordinary cultural achievement and economic power. The palace at Knossos alone covered more than 22,000 square meters, its labyrinthine corridors and chambers creating a structure so complex that it would later inspire the Greek myth of the Minotaur's maze. Yet even as Minoan culture flourished at its peak, the seeds of catastrophe were already germinating beneath the earth. Approximately 110 kilometers north of Crete lies the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. This volcanic landscape, with its distinctive caldera and dramatic cliffs, holds within it the geological story of one of history's most consequential natural disasters. Beneath Thera's surface, tremendous pressures were building as magma accumulated in chambers deep within the earth. The volcano had been active for millennia, but the forces at work during the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era were of an unprecedented magnitude. Geological evidence, preserved in layers of volcanic ash and pumice, tells of a catastrophe that would reshape not only the Minoan world, but the entire eastern Mediterranean region. The eruption occurred sometime between 1600 and 1500 before the Common Era. The exact date remains a subject of scholarly debate, with some evidence suggesting 1620 before the Common Era, though recent radiocarbon analysis and ice core data have produced varied results. What remains certain is that when Thera erupted, it did so with a force that has few parallels in recorded human history. The explosion was catastrophic beyond measure. The volcanic column rose to height exceeding 36 kilometers into the atmosphere, ejecting vast quantities of humus, ash, and rock into the sky. The sound of the eruption would have been audible across the entire Mediterranean basin, a phenomenon of such magnitude that it ranks among the loudest sounds ever produced by natural processes. The immediate effects on Thera itself were total and obliterating. Any settlements on the island were instantly annihilated. The archaeological record reveals that there had indeed been Minoan communities on Thera itself, particularly at a site known as Crete, where excavations have uncovered a thriving town with sophisticated architecture, beautiful pottery, and frescoes depicting scenes of daily life. This community was buried so suddenly and so completely that it was preserved in volcanic ash, creating what might be called an ancient Pompeii. The people of Crete had no time to flee. They were entombed where they stood, their final moments frozen in ash and pumice. But the destruction did not end with Thera itself. The eruption's effects rippled outward in all directions. A tsunami of enormous proportions was generated, with waves potentially reaching heights of 25 meters or more. These waves swept across the sea toward Crete, which lay tantalizingly close to the epicenter of destruction. The northern coast of Crete would have been struck first and most severely. The palace at Malea, situated on the northern shore, showed evidence of significant destruction and abandonment in the archaeological record. Whether this damage resulted directly from the tsunami or from the combination of seismic activity and tidal surge remains a question that archaeologists continue to investigate. The ash fallout was equally consequential. Vast quantities of volcanic material were dispersed across the region. Ash layers have been found in Egypt, in the Levant, and throughout the Mediterranean. On Crete itself, the ashfall would have been substantial, though not as overwhelming as on islands closer to Thera. Nevertheless, the ecological consequences were severe. Ash in the atmosphere would have reduced sunlight, affecting plant growth and agricultural productivity. Crops would have failed. The carefully maintained trade networks that had brought prosperity and goods to Minoan ports would have been disrupted. Ships would have been unable to navigate with safety. The sea itself would have been transformed into a hazardous environment. Yet despite these catastrophic events, the Minoan civilization did not vanish immediately. This is one of the most significant and often misunderstood aspects of the story. The eruption of Thera while devastating, was not the sole cause of Minoan decline. Rather, it was a turning point, a crisis that exposed vulnerabilities and set in motion processes of change that would ultimately transform Minoan society. Archaeological evidence reveals a complex pattern of recovery and adaptation following the eruption. Some sites were abandoned, but others were rebuilt and reoccupied. The palace at Knossos, though damaged, was reconstructed. The Minoans demonstrated remarkable resilience. They had survived and adapted to challenges before, and they did so again. Yet the character of their civilization began to shift. The recovery was slower than it might have been. Resources that had once been directed toward artistic achievement and monumental construction were increasingly devoted to practical concerns. The frescoes that adorned palace walls continued to be produced, but they became less elaborate. The pottery remained beautiful, but styles shifted subtly. The entire cultural ecosystem was under stress. More significantly, the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean was beginning to shift. The Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece had been developing in parallel with the Minoan civilization, though initially under Minoan cultural influence. Mycenaean society was more militaristic and hierarchical than Minoan society. Where the Minoans had relied on naval power and trade networks to project their influence, the Mycenaeans built fortified citadels and maintained standing armies. In the aftermath of the Thera eruption, when Minoan power was weakened and distracted, Mycenaean influence began to expand. Archaeological evidence shows increasing Mycenaean presence in Crete itself during this period. This was also a time when the mysterious Linear A script of the Minoans continued to be used for administrative and religious purposes, yet remained fundamentally indecipherable to modern scholars. The lack of a clear understanding of Minoan writing means that much about this period must be inferred from material remains rather than from written records. Tablets bearing Linear A script have been found at various palace sites, suggesting administrative sophistication and record-keeping practices. But without a clear understanding of the language, the specific details of Minoan governance and daily life during this turbulent period remain tantalizingly out of reach. The decades following the eruption represent a period of transformation and gradual decline. The great palatial complexes, which had been the centers of Minoan civilization, began to lose their preeminent status. Life did not cease in these places, but the energy and resources that had once flowed into their maintenance and elaboration began to diminish. Some scholars have argued that the eruption of Thera contributed to the development of the Atlantis legend in Greek mythology. The catastrophic destruction of an advanced island civilization swallowed by the sea or buried beneath the earth certainly bears resemblance to Plato's famous account of Atlantis, though the historical Thera and its Minoan inhabitants followed a different trajectory from the mythological island. The 15th century before the Common Era saw continued Mycenaean expansion into the Mediterranean. Crete, once the undisputed center of Eastern Mediterranean commerce and culture, found itself increasingly drawn into the sphere of Mycenaean influence. This was not necessarily a violent conquest, though military conflict may have occurred. Rather, it was a gradual process of cultural and political integration. Mycenaean pottery appears more frequently in Cretan archaeological contexts. Mycenaean architectural styles begin to influence Cretan building practices. The palace at Knossos itself, after its reconstruction following the Thera eruption, shows increasing evidence of Mycenaean influence in its decoration and organization. The Linear B script, which would eventually be used by the Mycenaeans, appears to have developed during this transitional period. Linear B is a later adaptation of Minoan writing systems, reflecting the encounter between Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations. The fact that the Mycenaeans adopted and adapted Minoan writing demonstrates the cultural prestige that Minoan civilization still maintained, even as its political power was waning. The Minoans had created one of the world's great civilizations, and even those who would eventually supersede them recognized the value of what they had achieved. The environmental consequences of the Thera eruption extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Volcanic ash in the upper atmosphere can affect climate patterns for years following a major eruption. Temperatures may drop, rainfall patterns may shift, and growing seasons may be disrupted. For an agricultural society like the Minoans, such changes could be profoundly disruptive. Crops that had thrived under one set of climatic conditions might fail under new conditions. The careful balance between population and available resources, which the Minoans had maintained through their trade networks and agricultural productivity, was disrupted. Food security became a concern in a way it had not been during the height of Minoan prosperity. The trade networks that had been the lifeblood of Minoan civilization were also affected. The immediate disruption caused by the eruption and its aftermath was followed by longer-term changes in Mediterranean trade patterns. The Mycenaeans, less dependent on the particular routes and partnerships that the Minoans had established, were able to develop alternative trading relationships. Gradually, Mycenaean merchants began to dominate the same routes that Minoan traders had once controlled. The great wealth that had flowed into Crete through maritime commerce began to diminish. Yet even during this period of decline and transformation, Minoan culture continued to produce works of beauty and sophistication. The late Minoan period, which extended from approximately 1500 to 1100 before the Common Era, saw the creation of some of the finest Minoan pottery ever produced. The marine style, which depicted octopi, starfish, and other sea creatures with fluid grace, represents a culmination of Minoan artistic achievement. These vessels were not merely functional containers, but works of art that expressed the Minoans' deep connection to the sea and their sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. The palace at Knossos, even as it underwent transformation and showed increasing Mycenaean influence, continued to serve as a center of cultural production and political authority. Frescoes were still painted on its walls, though the subjects and styles were evolving. Religious practices continued in the palace's ritual spaces. The great storage magazines, which had once held the surplus goods that made Minoan trade networks possible, continued to function, though perhaps with diminished activity. The palace remained a symbol of Minoan civilization, even if that civilization was no longer the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The archaeological record from this period reveals a society in transition. Some settlements were abandoned as people relocated to more defensible positions or to areas with better access to resources. New settlements were established in locations that had previously been less important. The population distribution across Crete began to shift. This pattern of settlement change suggests that the Minoans were adapting to new circumstances, reorganizing their society in response to changing conditions. It was not a catastrophic collapse, but a gradual transformation, a civilizational recalibration in the face of environmental stress and external pressure. The role of women in Minoan society, which had been relatively prominent during the height of Minoan civilization, appears to have shifted during this transitional period. The frescoes depicting women in prominent positions, participating in religious ceremonies and athletic competitions, become less common in the late Minoan period. This may reflect the influence of Mycenaean cultural values, which were more patriarchal and hierarchical than Minoan society. or it may reflect genuine changes in Minoan social organization as the civilization adapted to new circumstances. The evidence is ambiguous, but the trend suggests a society undergoing cultural as well as political transformation. The religious practices of the Minoans also evolved during this period. The worship of goddesses, which had been central to Minoan religion, continued but may have taken different forms. Peak sanctuaries, those high mountain places where the Minoans had conducted religious rituals for centuries, continued to be used. But the nature of the rituals and the beliefs they expressed may have shifted. The sacred symbols that had been so prominent in Minoan religion, such as the double axe and the horns of consecration, continued to appear in the archaeological record, but often in contexts that suggest different meanings or functions. The crisis precipitated by the Thera eruption and its aftermath was thus not merely a matter of physical destruction and immediate recovery. It was a fundamental challenge to the Minoan way of life. The prosperity that had been built on maritime trade and agricultural productivity was threatened. The political autonomy that the Minoans had maintained was challenged by rising Mycenaean power. The cultural confidence that had animated Minoan civilization during its height was shaken by the awareness that the natural world could unleash forces beyond human control or comprehension. The turning point had come. The trajectory of Minoan civilization, which had been rising for centuries, had begun to bend downward. Yet it is crucial to understand that this was not the end. The Minoans did not vanish in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. They continued to exist, to create, to maintain their distinctive culture, even as that culture was being transformed by internal and external pressures. The Minoan civilization that emerged from this crisis was different from the civilization that had preceded it, but it was not destroyed. It was changed, redirected, forced to adapt to new circumstances. The great age of Minoan independence and preeminence was ending, but the cultural achievements and innovations that the Minoans had created would endure, would be absorbed into the civilizations that succeeded them, and would ultimately influence the development of Western civilization itself. The volcanic island of Thera, situated approximately 70 miles north of Crete, held within its geological heart a force that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. Sometime around the year 1600 before the Common Era, this force unleashed itself with such violence that it would leave an indelible mark on human memory for millennia to come. The eruption that followed was not merely a natural disaster, it was a civilizational turning point, the moment when Europe's first great civilization began its transformation from living reality into legend. Archaeological evidence from the island of Santorini, which is what remains of ancient Thera after the cataclysm, reveals the magnitude of what occurred. The eruption ejected approximately 100 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere. The explosion itself was so powerful that it could have been heard across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin, a sound that would have reached the ears of Minoans working in their fields or sailing their merchant vessels. The force of the blast was capable of toppling buildings at considerable distances from the volcano itself. But the true devastation came not from the explosion alone, but from what followed. The eruption created a massive caldera, a sunken depression in the Earth's crust left behind when the volcano's chamber emptied. As the void filled with seawater, it generated waves of tremendous height and power. These tsunamis, traveling outward from Thera in all directions, would have struck Crete's northern shores with overwhelming force. Settlements built on the coast would have been swept away entirely. Harbors that had served as vital conduits for Minoan trade would have been transformed into scenes of devastation. The very infrastructure that had connected Minoan civilization to the broader Mediterranean world faced destruction. Yet the immediate damage from the waves, catastrophic as it was, represented only one aspect of the eruption's impact. The ash column that rose into the atmosphere would have blocked out the sun across vast regions. Darkness descended upon Crete during daylight hours. Ash fell like snow across the island, covering fields, coating buildings, and penetrating into storage chambers where precious grain and oil had been carefully preserved. The ash itself was abrasive and corrosive, damaging tools and machinery. Crops would have failed. The carefully maintained systems of agriculture that had supported Minoan civilization for centuries suddenly faced disruption. The consequences of this eruption manifested in the archaeological record in ways that are both clear and melancholy. At sites throughout Crete, evidence of habitation ceases abruptly around this time. Pottery vessels remain where they were left, interrupted mid-use. Storage jars lie overturned. In some locations, layers of pumice from the eruption cover the remains of human settlement, creating a temporal boundary that archaeologists can read with remarkable precision. The palace at Malea shows clear evidence of destruction, as do lesser settlements across the island. Something catastrophic had occurred, and the material culture of Minoan civilization bears witness to it. The question that has long occupied scholars is not whether the eruption occurred, but rather how severely it damaged Minoan civilization, and whether it represented the sole cause of the civilization's decline. For many decades, the eruption theory seemed to provide a complete explanation for the civilization's end. Here was a natural disaster of such magnitude that it could reasonably explain the collapse of even the most sophisticated society. Yet as archaeological evidence accumulated and techniques for dating became more refined, a more nuanced picture emerged. The eruption of Thera occurred sometime around 1600 before the Common Era, though the precise date remains subject to scholarly debate. Some evidence suggests the eruption may have occurred slightly later, perhaps around 1500. This dating uncertainty matters because it raises important questions about the timeline of Minoan decline. While the eruption certainly caused substantial damage to coastal settlements and disrupted trade networks, evidence suggests that the Minoan civilization did not simply vanish in the immediate aftermath. Instead, what appears to have occurred was a period of recovery and adaptation, followed by a more gradual transformation. In the centuries following the eruption, the great palace at Knossos was rebuilt and occupied. Evidence from the palace's later phases shows that habitation continued, though perhaps with reduced splendor and complexity. The palace underwent renovations and modifications. Pottery styles evolved but maintained continuity with earlier traditions. The frescoes that decorated the palace walls in these later periods show similar artistic sensibilities to the earlier masterpieces, though perhaps with somewhat less sophistication. The civilization that inhabited Crete in the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era was recognizably descended from the classical Minoan civilization, yet it was also unmistakably changed. What transformed most dramatically in this post-eruption period was not the existence of an Minoan civilization, but rather its political and cultural dominance. The evidence suggests that beginning around this time, the influence of Mycenaean civilization from mainland Greece began to increase substantially. Mycenaean pottery appears more frequently in Cretan archaeological contexts. Mycenaean artistic styles influenced Minoan craftspeople. Most significantly, written records from this period, preserved on clay tablets in the Linear B script, reveal the presence of Mycenaean Greek speakers in positions of authority at Knossos itself. The Linear B script represents a crucial development in understanding this transition. Unlike the earlier Linear A script, which remains undeciphered despite centuries of scholarly effort, Linear B has been successfully read since the 1950s. The decipherment revealed that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek language, suggesting that Greek-speaking peoples had become dominant in Crete by the time these tablets were written, likely in the 14th century before the Common Era. The palace at Knossos appears to have come under Mycenaean control, transforming from a center of indigenous Minoan authority into an outpost of mainland Greek power. This transition from Minoan to Mycenaean dominance represents one of the great historical transformations of the ancient world. It was not a sudden conquest, but rather a gradual process of cultural and political absorption. Mycenaean traders had long maintained contact with Crete, exchanging goods and ideas. After the disruption caused by the Thera eruption, this interaction intensified. Mycenaean settlers may have arrived on the island, or Mycenaean political authority may have been imposed through military means. The exact mechanism remains unclear, but the result is evident in the archaeological record. By the 13th century before the Common Era, Crete had become incorporated into the Mycenaean Greek world, rather than representing an independent cultural sphere. Yet even as Minoan civilization declined as a dominant force, its cultural legacy persisted and transformed. The artistic traditions of Minoan Crete profoundly influenced Mycenaean art. The naturalistic depictions of plants, animals, and humans that characterized Minoan frescoes appear in modified form in Mycenaean contexts. The elegant pottery styles developed by Minoan craftspeople influenced the ceramics produced in mainland Greece. The religious practices and beliefs that had animated Minoan religious expression left traces in later Greek religion. The goddess-centered spirituality of Minoan religion would echo through Greek mythology, though transformed and reinterpreted through Mycenaean and later Greek cultural frameworks. The most direct testimony to this cultural transmission appears in Greek mythology itself. The legends of King Minos, the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur preserve, in transformed and mythologized form, memories of Minoan Crete's power and sophistication. The story of Theseus traveling to Crete to slay the Minotaur and rescue Athenian youths reflects, scholars believe, actual conflicts between Mycenaean Greek cities and Cretan powers. The labyrinth of legend may preserve memories of the complex palace architecture at Knossos, which would indeed seem labyrinthine to those unfamiliar with its layout. The monstrous Minotaur itself may represent a distorted memory of Minoan religious practices, perhaps incorporating elements of bull worship or ritual that seemed foreign and strange to later Greek sensibilities. The figure of Minos himself occupies a fascinating position in this mythological legacy. In later Greek tradition, Minos became a legendary lawgiver and king of Crete, remembered for his wisdom and justice. Yet he was also depicted as demanding tribute from Athens and maintaining dominion over the seas. These contradictory characterizations may reflect the complex relationship that later Greeks maintained with the memory of Minoan civilization. They recognized Crete's former power and the sophistication of its culture, yet they also viewed it as belonging to a pre-Hellenic past, a civilization that had preceded and been superseded by their own Greek world. The island of Atlantis, described in Plato's dialogues as an advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves, has long been associated with Minoan Crete by scholars and popular imagination alike. Plato described Atlantis as possessing advanced technology, sophisticated art, and great wealth, characteristics that certainly resonated with what was known about Minoan civilization in antiquity. The destruction of Atlantis, described as occurring in a single day and night, bears some resemblance to the catastrophic eruption of Thera. Many scholars have theorized that Plato's account, whether taken literally or as philosophical allegory, may have been influenced by ancient traditions about Minoan Crete's destruction. The civilization that had seemed invincible, protected by its naval power and island location, had indeed suffered a catastrophe that transformed its world. The final decline of Minoan civilization as a distinctive cultural entity occurred gradually over several centuries following the Thera eruption. By the 12th century before the Common Era, the great palaces had been abandoned. The palace at Knossos, which had been inhabited and modified for several centuries after the eruption, was eventually deserted. The causes of this final abandonment remain somewhat unclear, though climate change, further disruptions, and the general transformation of the Mediterranean world during this period likely all contributed. The late Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean faced a period of significant upheaval during the 12th century, often referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. Trade networks that had sustained civilization for centuries became disrupted. Populations moved and migrated. Established political orders fractured and reformed. Yet even as Minoan civilization ceased to exist as a living, evolving culture, its legacy persisted in multiple forms. The artistic traditions it had pioneered influenced the development of Greek art for centuries. The religious practices and mythological traditions it had generated became woven into the fabric of Greek culture. The technical innovations it had developed, from advanced plumbing systems to sophisticated architectural techniques, influenced later builders and engineers. The writing systems it had created, particularly Linear B when adapted by the Mycenaeans, contributed to the development of the Greek alphabet and written language. The archaeological study of Minoan civilization, beginning in earnest in the late 19th century with the excavations of Arthur Evans at Knossos, has revealed the sophistication and refinement of this ancient society. The palace complexes with their multiple stories, elaborate drainage systems, and decorated chambers stand as testimony to the organizational capacity and aesthetic sensibility of Minoan civilization. The frescoes that decorated these palaces, preserved by the very catastrophes that destroyed the civilization, offer windows into Minoan life, religious practice, and artistic achievement. The pottery, jewelry, and other artifacts recovered from archaeological sites demonstrate technical skill and artistic sophistication that rival contemporary civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Perhaps most significantly, Minoan civilization represents a unique moment in Mediterranean history, when an island-based culture achieved continental influence without the militaristic emphasis that characterized many other ancient civilizations. While the Minoans certainly possessed military capacity and engaged in warfare, the primary sources of their power appear to have been commercial, artistic, and cultural. Their prosperity derived from trade rather than conquest. Their influence spread through the appeal of their art and the value of their goods rather than through military domination. In this respect, Minoan civilization offers a different model of how human societies can achieve power and influence. The mystery of the linear script, which remains undeciphered despite over a century of scholarly effort, represents one of the final enigmas of Minoan civilization. Hundreds of clay tablets and inscriptions in Linear A have been recovered, yet their language and meaning remain unknown. Some scholars believe Linear A may record a non-Indo-European language, possibly related to languages spoken in Anatolia or elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. Others have proposed connections to various ancient languages. The inability to read these texts represents a significant gap in our understanding of Minoan civilization. The records that the Minoans themselves kept remain closed to us, their administrative documents, religious texts, and historical records locked away in a script we cannot yet decipher. This inability to read linear A serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of historical knowledge. Despite the wealth of archaeological evidence, despite the frescoes and pottery and architectural remains, despite the detailed records that later civilizations left about Minoan Crete, there remains a fundamental gap in our understanding. The Minoans themselves, their own voices and perspectives, remain largely inaccessible to us. We know them primarily through what they created and through what others said about them, but their own words, preserved in linear A, remain silent. The legacy of Minoan civilization extends into the modern world as well. Contemporary Crete, built upon the same island that sustained the Minoans, maintains connections to this ancient past. The archaeological sites at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and other locations have become destinations for scholars and visitors seeking to understand this ancient world. The artifacts housed in museums, particularly the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in Crete, display the artistic achievements of Minoan civilization to modern audiences. The frescoes of dolphins and flowers, the elegant pottery, the intricate jewelry all speak across the millennia to contemporary viewers, offering glimpses into a world that flourished and transformed thousands of years ago. The story of Minoan civilization ultimately represents a profound meditation on the nature of human achievement and the forces that shape civilizations. The Minoans created a sophisticated culture, developed trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean, produced art of remarkable beauty and refinement, and influenced the development of later civilizations. Yet their civilization was not immune to the forces of nature or history. The eruption of Thera, the gradual expansion of Mycenaean influence, the transformations occurring across the Mediterranean world in the Late Bronze Age, these forces combined to transform and eventually to end Minoan civilization as a distinct entity. Yet in another sense, Minoan civilization did not truly end. It transformed. Its cultural elements were absorbed into Greek civilization. Its artistic traditions influenced the development of Mediterranean art. Its religious practices and mythological traditions became woven into the stories that Greeks told about their own past. The memory of Minoan Crete, though transformed and mythologized, persisted in Greek culture and eventually reached later civilizations through the accounts of ancient writers and historians. Today, as archaeologists continue to excavate Cretan sites and refine their understanding of Minoan civilization, the story of this ancient world continues to be written. New discoveries add details and nuances to our understanding. Technological advances allow scholars to extract information from artifacts that earlier generations could only observe. The mystery of linear A remains tantalizingly unsolved, promising future revelations about Minoan language and culture. The eruption of Thera, preserved in the geological record and in the archaeological layers it created, continues to be studied and understood with ever greater precision. The Minoans, Europe's first great civilization, rose from humble Bronze Age settlements to create a sophisticated culture of remarkable achievement. Their palaces dominated the Mediterranean. Their traders carried their goods to distant shores. Their artists created works of enduring beauty, and their influence shaped the development of later civilizations. Then, through a combination of natural catastrophe and historical transformation, their world changed. The civilization that had seemed so powerful and permanent was transformed, absorbed, and eventually mythologized. Yet in being transformed, it was also preserved. The memory of Minoan Crete, though no longer a living civilization, endures in the hearts and minds of those who study it, in the stories that preserve its memory, and in the material culture that testifies to its existence and achievements. The fire and water that buried Minoan civilization also preserved it, freezing it in time and allowing future generations to witness the accomplishments of Europe's first great civilization.